I started Minerva University because I saw a problem in our secondary and post-secondary education institutions. And it wasn't just all of the problems that are being talked about popularly. It wasn't just access to education. It wasn't just completion rates. It wasn't just the cost of education. It wasn't just the nature of what should or shouldn't be taught. It was actually a fundamental flaw in what our conception was of what a university or high school education should look like. And I had a different theory about what education should look like. An education that was anchored in frameworks and ideas that you can apply in a broad-based way. And I knew that a different philosophy of education couldn't actually be implemented unless you demonstrate it at the highest level. And so my first task was to build an institution that would be noticed all over the world, and that would prove that it can provide a better education than Harvard, Stanford, Oxford, Cambridge, and do so with a student body that wasn't already guaranteed to be rich because their parents were already rich. And that's what we did. We built Minerva University that, while we were running it, was the most selective, most effective university in history. Produced better outcomes in job placements, graduate school placements, in entrepreneurship than any of the benchmark universities that were best in class in that sense. And we were able to then leverage that point of view, and as we made the university independent and run on its own and they can do what they want with it, most important for us was to demonstrate that we could then take that same intellectual property and bring it to existing institutions, both by reforming higher education institutions where we work with all sorts of really cutting-edge universities with bold leadership to reform their curricula, to build new programs, etc., but also to create a high school program, the Minerva Baccalaureate, that brings the same principles, the same ideas, but in an even more sophisticated way to high schools. So one good example is the work that we did with the University of Miami. The University of Miami has wanted to build an interdisciplinary program for years and was never actually able to do it. And so they worked with us to help them design, build, and implement a 3-year bachelor's degree in innovation, technology, and design. We did a similar program, but with a different focus on triple bottom line businesses with ESADE, which is one of the top business schools in Europe. We built a College of Interdisciplinary Studies at Zayed University, which is one of the flagship universities in the United Arab Emirates. And we built a brand new university in Mexico called the Universidad de la Libertad. And now we're working with some marquee partners, from Berkeley Law School to the University of Southern California's Annenberg School of Communications to the University of Tokyo in Japan, to help them also reform what and how they teach. Universities, as we all know, educate a small sliver of the global population. They also are quite independent of one another. And reforming university education in a large and scalable way is challenging. At the same time, students, once they emerge from puberty, once they basically come into high school, are ready to cement a new approach to education, which they do in any case. Obviously, if you look at what a 3rd grader does versus what a 9th grader does, that's a very big difference. And we realized that if we really wanted to have broad-based effect in the world of education, that high school is the system that we can have the broadest reach in, both by addressing students who may or may not go to college, but also in demonstrating to highly regulated institutions, such as high schools, that there is a better way. And our goal is to work initially with independent schools, but eventually to get entire governments to implement a Minerva Baccalaureate approach in their national curricula. And that's where we think we can have some truly broad-based sweeping effects.
Right.
We were first funded to build a high school program in the summer of 2020. And this was, as people sometimes forget, the height of the COVID pandemic. And so we were given the challenge of how do you create a remote high school experience which is better than a brick and mortar high school experience. And that is the challenge that we initially took. And so for that year of COVID, the academic year, which was September of 2020 through May of 2021, June of 2021, we took a small group of remote learners in the United States and in the Dominican Republic, and we demonstrated that we could indeed, as those students reported back to us, provide them better education, a more engaging education online than they got in the brick and mortar school. And that was quite a remarkable achievement, because nobody during COVID said that they liked remote education more than in-person education. But that experience is something that they had, and we realized that we had something really special in our approach to the Minerva Baccalaureate. And so the following fall, in the fall of 2021, we decided we would launch the program. I actually spent a whole day with the Grace International Academy about a month ago, and managed to not only have conversation with students, but really be impressed with how much it is that they have learned. And perhaps my favorite exercise is I asked all of the students who've gone through the program, as well as the students who are in their third year, I asked them what was their favorite learning objective. Our program is comprised of about 30 different learning objectives that really help students understand how to make sense and problem solve in the world. And my most happiest moment in the interaction with them came from the fact that as I asked them each to talk about their favorite learning objective, almost every student picked a different learning objective in each group that I asked. And that was really profound. It was profound because the reality of a great education is one that you can actually apply in your day-to-day life. And the fact that every student could understand a different aspect of that and take it to heart and internalize it as their favorite was really great. I remember when I was an undergraduate, there were 15 required courses in the undergraduate program at Wharton, and only one was useful, and everybody knew that only one was useful. And so the fact that we created a curriculum where everything was useful and different students were able to really lean in and make it their own, I thought was really exciting. There are two aspects that really impressed me about how the students internalized the program. The first was how they were engaged in their learning. We sometimes confuse a student's performance in school with their engagement. We say, oh, a student has gotten a bunch of A's, therefore they really learned. The reality is that most students who perform well in school just learned how to take a test. They didn't actually absorb the material. They didn't actually internalize knowledge. They weren't excited about the classes they were taking and the tests they had to take. They merely knew that this is what they have to do to go to university or get to the next stage in their life, and they did it. And that stood in very sharp contrast with the MBAC students, who were truly excited about what they learned. They internalized it. They were happy to go to class. In fact, several commented on the difference between their Minerva Baccalaureate schooling and the kind of schooling they did in middle school, which was all very much teach to a test, cram, pass, etc., and how dispiriting that world was versus how energizing the Minerva Baccalaureate world was. So that was category one that was very heartening to hear. The second category was how they expressed clarity of use of what it is that they've learned. That they demonstrated that being able to understand the difference between correlation and causation, problem-solving techniques, and understanding how do you actually cater what you say so that people that are listening to you can understand what you mean to say. All of those things were aspects that they were using in their day-to-day lives. And again, that's something that if you think about what a high school education provides, almost never happens. Who comes home from a chemistry class, from a history class, from a math class, and says, oh boy, thank goodness I learned these things, I'm using them every day. That almost is incomprehensible. And so that engagement, which is related in the first way, is directly tied to the second aspect, which is the ability to apply what it is that you've learned in day-to-day situations. Yes, the Habits of Mind foundational concept framework that we use in our higher education program is identical to what we do in our Minerva Baccalaureate program. The scope of the program is much tighter. And so in the higher education world, we cover many more Habits of Mind foundational concepts. In fact, in the Minerva University curriculum, we've designed it to have 80 of them. And we explicitly introduce them and repeat them in 1 year. And then in the second, third, and fourth year, we implicitly give students the ability to apply them. In the Minerva Baccalaureate program, we only have about 30 Habits of Mind foundational concepts, we refer to as cross-disciplinary learning objectives. But the students marinate and apply them across 3 years. And so what the Minerva University students gain in breadth of learning, the Minerva Baccalaureate students trade off for true depth of understanding. And in the Minerva Baccalaureate context, these 30 tools are not only repeated over and over and over again, they're explicitly demonstrated in ways that we can't have done in our university model initially, the dimensions in which the student applies them. So for every one of these learning objectives at the university level, we traditionally track them across 1 dimension and 5 different contexts. At the Minerva Baccalaureate level, we track them across 4 dimensions and 60 different context combinations. And so the student in the Minerva Baccalaureate has the opportunity to master these 30 habits and concepts in much, much greater depth than a similar program that we designed in the higher education level. We have an interesting visual representation that looks a little bit like a spaghetti slide in the sense that we identify these big meta capacities, critical thinking, creative problem solving, effective communications, effective interactions as an example. In the MBAC scenario, the ability to orient yourself, to make sense of things, to be able to communicate ideas, etc. And then we break that down into component parts, right? These habits and concepts that students will learn that oftentimes roll up into a subcompetency in between the large capacity and the particular learning objective. Then each one of these habits and concepts gets introduced in a particular course, the first time that a student will encounter it. So for example, we may teach the idea of satisfying constraints when you solve a mathematical equation. But then 3 weeks after it's introduced in a math class, constraint satisfaction will show up in a chemistry class, right? Where you are asked to think about mixing 3 chemicals and seeing what happens. And rather than just saying, oh, smoke will come out, not particularly relevant, you think about, well, what are the kinds of conditions or constraints that are necessary? How about quantities? How about sequencing of what chemical goes with what first? What binds to what first? What about agitation, temperature, light? All of a sudden, those principles are much more generalizable to other physical interactions. And then that learning objective doesn't just go from that one class, from math to science, it'll show up in history. You'll think about various constraints on why a certain country was successful in one battle, but lost a different battle. You'll look at it in literature class. You're writing a poem and you're particularly constrained. You want to write a Shakespearean sonnet. There are rules and constraints on how to get a message across. Same principles, different contexts. And then that context begins to interweave, not just from subject to subject, but from other dimension of application to yet another. So for example, are you able to apply that same learning objective when you produce your own work, write a Shakespearean sonnet, versus when you critique somebody else's work? Critique somebody's Shakespearean sonnet and how they constructed it. Some of us are better critics than producers. Others of us are better producers than critics. That's both something that's important. Are you able to apply that same idea when you're asked that question in class spontaneously versus when you're told to take a week and think about it and be deliberative in your thinking as you build a project? Are you able to apply that concept when you're asked to figure out what are the constraints versus when you're not prompted to think about constraint satisfaction and merely saying, why is it that this battle was won and this battle was lost? What are the factors that are associated with it? And that is something to think through. Now, all of the other dozens of learning objectives have that same strand that goes through, but they're introduced in other sessions of other classes, and they show up in other ways in other classes, and they all interweave in this four-dimensional, actually, approach until the student becomes better and better and better at applying them in more and more generalizable contexts and scenarios.
It's like they are weaving into like a braid, basically.
Correct,
right?
correct. And we refer to that as the braid because the braid has the strand that is showing up in all sorts of different dimensions and intertwines with other ideas, and they hit different subjects, different context areas, etc., until it kind of culminates at the end. One of the things that we are very focused on is making sure that a Minerva education is universally applicable and that the students are learning it in such a way that they have practice in applying what they've learned in dramatically different, not just cultural, but other kind of contextual opportunities. And our curriculum itself is global in nature. It is largely taking examples from different parts of the world, different types of elements, and showing how the same thinking tools can be used to analyze those different perspectives. One thing that we hope will occur over time as more and more schools come online, that because the curriculum is interchangeable, that students will be able to experience Minerva Baccalaureate virtual exchanges, if not physical exchanges, between these schools over the years. And we hope that over time we'll be enabling that as well. I truly believe that our greatest contribution to the field of education is in demonstrating that you can teach transferable learning. Many of the leading learning scientists have concluded that you can't teach transferable learning because they've studied high school, they've studied universities, and they haven't found an example of an institution that produces students who can apply what they've learned in new contexts. What is absurd about their conclusion is not realizing that high schools and universities all teach in the same way. You show up in a class, you study a subject matter, and you move on to another class. In high school, at least you have some schools that are a little bit more experiential or project-based, but they rarely spend time teaching the frameworks that you need to apply across all projects. And so again, students don't have the language, they don't have the instruction that enables them to be transferable learners. And the fact that we've been able to demonstrate historic levels of not only knowledge retention, but doing so in a way that you can apply that knowledge across all of these different contexts is, I believe, the most important contribution we've made to the field of education.